So thanks very much. I'm delighted to be able to present the results of the next 10 minutes of the survey that we did on, it was titled, what do Austrians and Americans think about each other, what do they think about the international order? And it came about largely because the Botstiber Institute is interested in the relationship between Austria and the United States, but we really didn't have a good understanding what do Austrians think about Americans and Americans think about Austria. So therefore, we had the idea last year to undertake a survey, and it's taken us a year to bring that to fruition. I just will briefly present the results. I just wanted to introduce just my research team. Lara Zwindlinger, who is a PhD candidate, and Caroline Meyer is also here, who they've done amazing work in researching questions, looking at other surveys, and ultimately running statistics and analyzing the survey and assisting with report writing. I'm a professor of comparative Austrian politics. I used to be at the University of Pittsburgh, and for the last 10 years, the University of Salzburg, and there's my website, which is my work. Why did we do this survey now? I think the answer is obvious. We have opinions and assumptions about each other, but there was simply not recent data. The last survey dates back to the 1980s. Moreover, this was a survey both on the Austrians, on Americans, and on Americans, on Austrians. It was timely. Why? Global relations are in flux, our society is in flux, the media landscape is changing, and there are many assumptions when we're missing data. It's also a comprehensive survey. We have some 30 to 40 questions, but 100 items. That allows us not only to present snapshots, but to go probe deeper and do analysis and explore and go into some of the deeper explanations. We will present much of that, and the analysis is still ongoing. And we're very grateful to the Botstiber Institute for funding, and the survey was conducted. We all work at the University of Salzburg. And the survey was carried out by an Austrian survey firm based on a set of questions that we developed. The Austrian survey went into the field in February, so very recent data. It was a random national sample of Austrians, and the American survey, the field work, took place in April. So these are very, very recent data. We got a lot of the US data just 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we analyzed them since. What are some of the findings? So Austrians tend to have a rather negative view of the United States. In fact, almost half of the Austrian respondents didn't have a negative view. Only very few had a positive view, 14%. There were also some undecideds. If they wanted to find out whether the view had changed recently, we asked them, 65% indeed suggested their view on the US had worsened or worsened a lot, and 12% thought it had improved. If we wanted to know, so then we were curious, why did it worsen? What was the driving that? We gave them a number of options that you can see the red bar at the bottom, and sort of that those who said it worsened a lot, it was due to the election results. You can see the election results was a couple of them reasons. There were other reasons, but the elections took top spot for the Austrians. And then the question is, why were the Austrians upset about the election results? How can we make sense of that? And if you give the Austrians options, then you see they see the election outcome very negatively because they fear for some of the issues that matter to them. So if you ask them, what are the issues that matter for you, you can see that climate change was the number one issue, and over 70% of Austrians thought the issue of climate change would be impacted worse by the elections. Also the European Union, also global politics, and also the economy. Interestingly, Austria, they saw that Austria would be impacted as negative as some of the other issues, which they still see a negative impact, but not as much as some of the other issues. So Austrians were able to distinguish between the two. So when we move on to the perception of the US system across a number of areas, we get sort of mixed results. And you can see in the contradictions in some of the results that Austrians don't understand very well American society, and there's quite a bit lost in translation across the Atlantic. So On one hand, Austrians thought the American education system is the greatest. They more tended to think it's more negatively than positively. But on the other hand, they thought Americans are well-educated. It doesn't quite go together. America is seen as democratic, so 50% Russian is democratic, 50% white secure, religious, but then they still think of the United States as the land of the free, land of opportunity, so traditional views still prevail, but also as a dangerous society and a society with a poor welfare state. Austrians tend to view Americans much more favorably, see them as friendly, as hardworking, as well-educated, as honest, but also, again, some of the cliches, superficial, uncultured, violent, and arrogant. Moving on, I will comment. However, we asked Austrians how much has the US contributed to Austrian impact in Austria. And Austrians are quite aware that after Germany, the United States is the country with the second biggest impact on Austria, and by far the most impact of any other powerful nation. And even when you ask them, okay, where did it have the biggest impact? Technology, economy, media, we would generally agree with that assessment. Let's look at some, at the end, before we move to the American survey, some explanatory factors. So who are the ones who are most pro-American? It's interesting to find that ideology matters a great deal. Austrians, who tend to be right-wing, tend to be most in favor of the most positive election outcome. Also, Austrians who voted for right-wing parties or left-wing parties tend to be more in favor of the election outcome. Younger Austrians are more in favor of the US, but it's more complicated. Austrians who tend to use social media more often tend to be more in favor of the United States, those who speak better English, and those who want a strong leader rather than a skilled politician. So I'll give you an example. Behind me you see Austrian parties, from the communists on the left to the radical right Freedom Party on the right. You can see the approval increases. So the people who vote for the Austrian Freedom Party tend to be most excited about the outcome of the last election, and the other parties are somewhere in between. If we ask people, then what do you think how much of the US contributed to solving all the problems? We look at this by age. You see the oldest Austrians, 64 to 60 plus, the most skeptical, while the youngest Austrians, 60 to 29, tend to be the most, tend to be agreed about the most in favor of the US, and the most in this area. Last slide, something that's super interesting is, and that dovetails with other research that's going on. What if you take characteristics like age, gender, education, put it together? How did these three characteristics, what effect does that have? So let's split our sample and let's look at the Austrians with the lowest level of education, and again by age group. You can see that the 60 plus crowd is the most unfavorable about the US. And you can see that the blue line are men and the red line is the women. And you can see the younger they are, the more they favor the United States. And men and women move parallel. So we don't see any gender differences. If you move to the medium education level, they're all over the map. And I could tell you a lot about this, but I don't want to take up more time. But nonetheless, more or less, gender doesn't matter. But then we get to the most educated, the most secondary. That's super interesting because if we look at the tail end, we see that young men move to the right, young women move to the left, and they diverge by political preference. So young men more enamored with Donald Trump, women much more skeptical. And we find that in other surveys as well, including in the United States, and we see this also in this survey in Austria. Consequences, if you ask Austrians, imagine the US and the EU having a fight with this conflict. What should Austria do? Should it stay neutral? Should it side with the US? Or should it side with the European Union? I would expect neutrality, but it's interesting that siding with the EU that came out ahead before neutrality and before siding with the US. However, when you ask them, how sure are you Austrians about your choice? They're at least sure about the US. So they're most in favor of the EU, but at least sure about why they're in favor. Very quickly to the Americans, the American survey. So they're much more positive about the Austrians, so 67% like Austrian society, almost 90% like the Austrian political system because they see Austria as a stable, prosperous democracy. 50% say relations are friendly, the other 50% are not so sure. They just think it's improving, but there's no relation at all, and they can't divorce. I don't want to show you on the slides, but just as a summary, Americans like most about Austria, the people, arts and culture, the scenery, and the landscape. However, if you ask the Americans who associate with Austria, it's not sound amusing, it's not cliches, they actually associate Austria with a prosperous democracy, with a welfare state, some say socialism, with bridge building, and with being very welcoming to immigrants. What do Americans dislike about Austria is the Nazi past and the anti-Semitism. As you can see here, 50% of the Americans, the respondents, thought Austrians are either very or somewhat anti-Semitic. Who is most positive about Austria? The oldest Americans, people plus, those who get information from classical media, those who travel abroad, those who are most educated, those with European ancestry, those who live in medium-sized towns and cities, and those for whom Austria's Nazi past matters is not a dominant issue. You can see here you ask people that how much does it matter, Austria's Nazi past matter to you? Those who say it matters strongly are least favorable towards Austria, least positive. Those who say it doesn't matter at all are the most positive. How important is Austria to Americans? If we ask about all the countries that are Austrian neighbors, it's Italy first, Germany second, Switzerland third, Austria comes in fourth place. So last slide, what do Americans think about international politics? What are references? Again, the US is divided. If you ask the US to become weaker or stronger lately, 45% Americans become weaker and 33% stronger. Americans favor traditional allies and alliances. Americans favor the US should stand up for democracy. They favor strong ties to their ancestral homelands. The most popular countries on our side, UK, Canada, Japan, EU, and Israel. Least popular, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, and Iran. That's the last slide. Stand strong for democracy, followed by reaching out to adversaries, down to short-term alliances, to going it well. And with that, I will leave.